My name's Anthia, and I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who gets kicked out of her own mother's house, with a toddler in her arms. But that's exactly what happened. And no, I didn't cry. Not then, not when my mother shoved me and my 2-year-old daughter Mia onto the cold concrete steps in the middle of the night. I didn't cry because I had learned early on that tears wouldn't change anything in that house. They only made me a target. It all began when my marriage crumbled. My husband, Daniel, didn't leave with a fight, didn't scream, didn't pack a bag. He just vanished. One ordinary Tuesday afternoon, I found a small folded note by the sink. His words were brief, almost casual. I've met someone else. I'm in love. I'm alive again. No explanation. No goodbye. Just those few lines that felt like a knife through my heart. I stared at that note for what felt like hours, gripping Mia in my arms, feeling her tiny heartbeat against mine, realizing my life had just changed forever. Rent was due in 3 days, the fridge was almost empty, and I had no one to turn to except my mom. Calling her felt like walking into a minefield. She sounded kind at first, almost sympathetic, but I should have known better. My mother has favorites. Always has, always will. My sister, Amanda, is her golden child, and Amanda's daughter, Lucy, is practically worshipped. They are treated like royalty in our house, untouchable, perfect. Everything I did, every little misstep, was measured against them, and I never measured up. I packed a small bag with what little I had and moved back in. I told myself it would be temporary, that I'd keep my head down, care for Mia, and wait until I could get on my feet. But I quickly remembered why I had avoided living there as an adult. My mother's home wasn't a sanctuary. It was a battlefield disguised as comfort. At first, life was tolerable because I kept quiet and invisible. I cooked, cleaned, did laundry, and made sure Mia was fed and happy. My mother would make small comments that seemed like jokes but were really barbed accusations. Don't get too comfortable here, Anthia. We wouldn't want you to think this is permanent. Amanda barely spoke to me, except when she needed me to babysit Lucy or run errands. And Lucy? Well, Lucy barely noticed Mia or me. Every day felt like walking on glass. A spilled glass of milk could turn into a lecture. A misfolded towel could be an accusation of laziness. My mother never lifted a finger to help, yet she always found ways to remind me that I was lesser than her perfect children. It was exhausting. And then there were the incidents that cut deeper than anything else. Like the time Mia accidentally knocked over a glass of juice. My mother screamed so loudly it scared Mia half to tears. Mia didn't speak for hours afterward, only curled up in my lap, shaking and terrified. I confronted my mom gently, asking if she realized how scared she had made a 2-year-old. She rolled her eyes and said, "You're too sensitive. You always overreact." Or the time with the yogurts. Amanda had bought a pack of strawberry yogurts, Lucy's favorite, and left them in the fridge. Lucy asked me for one, and I gave it to her. That should have been simple, harmless. But Amanda came home, screaming about theft, how I had no right to give her daughter food without permission. And then my mother joined in, calling me ungrateful, claiming I was trying to claim the house as my own. That night, she dropped the bomb. "Apologize to Amanda and Lucy tonight, or you're out." I couldn't. I wouldn't. Not when I'd been treated like a stranger in my own family for years. Not when every small act of love toward my child had been punished, mocked, or ignored. And so, in the dead of night, she grabbed trash bags, stuffed my clothes inside, woke Mia, and shoved us out the door. Barefoot. Half asleep. Cold. Standing on the concrete steps, holding my daughter close, I didn't cry. Instead, I called my grandmother. It was nearly midnight, and I assumed she'd be asleep. But she answered. She listened. And when I finished telling her everything, the yelling, the threats, the sheer terror on Mia's little face, she didn't interrupt once. She didn't scold me. She just asked calmly where I was. I told her I was parked near a grocery store, engine running, trying to keep Mia warm in a blanket. She told me to stay put and keep the car on. I spent that night sitting upright, watching Mia sleep curled against me. My mind replayed my mother's face, the way she had thrown our lives into garbage bags as if we were disposable. And yet, amidst the fear and cold, there was a strange clarity. I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't broken. Not yet. The next morning, my grandmother called again. She told me to come back to the house, but this time, it wasn't just a return. It was a reckoning. The balance of power that had ruled our family for years was about to shift. And I was about to witness it, firsthand. When I drove back to the house that morning, my stomach was a knot of dread and determination. The driveway felt impossibly long. Every step I took toward the front door made my heart pound harder. And yet, I wasn't afraid in the way I had been the night before. I was angry. Angry at the injustice, at the favoritism, at the years of silent humiliation. Mia clutched my hand as if sensing the storm I was carrying inside me. The house looked quiet, deceptively normal. But I could feel the tension radiating from within. My mother was sitting at the dining table, arms crossed like a judge ready to deliver a sentence. Amanda scrolled on her phone with a kind of bored detachment, and Lucy peeked around her legs, curious but cautious. My dad lingered near the hallway, shifting from one foot to another, unsure of how to enter this battlefield. And then there was my grandmother. She stood in the center of the room, a presence I had always associated with warmth, but today, she radiated authority. She didn't yell, she didn't raise her voice. She just looked at my mother and asked the simplest, most cutting question imaginable. Why did you put Anthia and Mia out on the street last night? My mother started her rehearsed explanations. Disrespect, boundaries, claims to the house. Typical excuses. But my grandmother stopped her mid-sentence. She reminded everyone that the house wasn't theirs to command. That it had been her generosity, her money, that made their comfort possible. And in that moment, everything changed. I sat down, holding Mia in my lap. I didn't speak, because I didn't need to. My grandmother spoke for me. She announced that from this moment forward, no one who treated her generosity like a weapon would continue to enjoy it unchecked. She instructed my parents to hand over their bank cards, immediately, without protest. Amanda's protests were loud and dramatic. She accused me of manipulation, of scheming. My mother tried to argue, but her voice faltered under my grandmother's calm authority. I realized then that the power dynamic had shifted overnight. No longer was I the one at their mercy. I was being protected, legitimized, and my tormentors were finally exposed for what they were: entitled, selfish, and accustomed to control that was no longer theirs. The room erupted, as if my grandmother's words had struck lightning. My mother begged, tears streaming down her face, though not for apology, more for the loss of her comfort and dominance. Amanda stomped and yelled, insisting I had orchestrated the entire scenario. I didn't respond. I just held Mia and let them unravel, piece by piece. By mid-morning, whispers of our family upheaval had reached the neighbors. I could hear the buzzing of phones, distant voices carrying fragments of the story. It was surreal. For years, my mother and sister had curated an image of perfection, of control, of untouchable superiority. That image shattered in hours, leaving them scrambling to explain, defend, and manipulate the narrative. Meanwhile, my grandmother had made her intentions clear. Changes were permanent. She wasn't interested in temporary peace. She wanted accountability. She wanted the household to reflect respect, fairness, and boundaries, things that had been absent for far too long. And that meant, from that morning on, my mother, Amanda, and my father would no longer have unchallenged control. 2 days later, the real consequences began to unfold. My grandmother, practical as ever, ensured that Amanda and my mother could no longer exploit the house or our family resources without oversight. Amanda, used to privilege, suddenly had to face bills, chores, and responsibilities she had never had to consider before. My mother, who had spent decades asserting dominance, now had rules to follow that limited her ability to manipulate. And then came the unexpected twist. Lucy's father, who had previously been distanced from the chaos, showed up unannounced. He had come to collect his daughter for the stability she deserved, tired of her being dragged into family turmoil. Amanda, suddenly powerless in front of him, had no choice but to comply. Lucy remained partially with me, adjusting to an environment where she was truly seen and cared for. The small victories compounded, and the household's hierarchy began to settle into a new order, one where empathy and protection replaced fear and favoritism. I watched all of this unfold silently, holding Mia close. For the first time in years, I felt safe, not because my mother or sister had changed, but because I now had an ally in my grandmother and a clear understanding of my own strength. I had survived the night, the eviction, and the abuse, and I had done so without compromising my dignity. The chaos around me was a reflection of the consequences of long-standing abuse, and for the first time, I was not the one paying the price. By the end of the week, Amanda and my mother were forced to confront the reality of their new limitations. They could no longer dominate, demean, or dismiss without accountability. My grandmother's interventions had set the stage for a family reckoning that would take months to fully process. And I, for the first time in years, could breathe. The house that had been a battlefield was beginning to feel like a place where justice, however delayed, was finally being served. The morning after my grandmother's intervention, the house felt strange, quiet, almost too quiet. I had expected chaos, shouting, accusations flying, maybe even a dramatic tantrum from Amanda, but the initial storm had passed. What replaced it was a slow, simmering tension, a kind of nervous energy that you could feel in the air with every step, every glance. My mother barely looked at me. Her usual condescending smirk was gone, replaced with tight lips and darting eyes. Amanda stayed in her room for hours, scrolling her phone, glaring at nothing in particular, mumbling under her breath about the injustice and how I had somehow manipulated my grandmother into turning the house against them. My father hovered awkwardly between rooms, trying to remain neutral but clearly feeling powerless for the first time in decades. I stayed in the kitchen with Mia on my hip, making breakfast and humming quietly, pretending this was all normal. But the subtle shift in the household dynamic was palpable. My grandmother had restructured the rules. Bills would be monitored, privileges would be earned, and manipulation would not be tolerated. It was a slow dismantling of the power my mother and sister had relied on for so long, and the tension this caused was deliciously satisfying. Not for revenge, but for justice. Word of the incident spread faster than I had anticipated. By mid-morning, neighbors were whispering, cousins were texting, and family friends were calling to ask if it was true that my grandmother had taken such a firm stance. Some accused me of stirring drama intentionally, trying to get back at my mother and sister. Others quietly congratulated me, expressing relief that someone had finally stood up to the favoritism and abuse that had been normalized in our family for years. Meanwhile, Amanda's world was unraveling in ways I hadn't anticipated. For years, she had relied on my mother's protection to shield her from responsibility. Now, under my grandmother's watchful eye, every choice had consequences. The first sign was small. Amanda had to do her own grocery shopping instead of expecting my mother or me to pick up what she needed. Next came chores, cleaning, laundry, organizing her space. Tasks she had never considered were now hers to manage, and she was failing spectacularly. Her frustration was obvious. She stomped through the house, muttering, complaining that the rules were unfair. Lucy, too, sensed the shift. No longer treated as the untouchable golden child, she observed the cracks in her mother's armor. The young girl was confused, asking me for guidance, and I couldn't help but feel protective. My role had subtly shifted from invisible helper to guardian, not just for Mia, but for Lucy as well. My mother, predictably, doubled down. She tried passive-aggressive tactics, snide remarks, leaving little reminders around the house, and even small manipulations intended to provoke guilt. But my grandmother was steadfast. She had anticipated these maneuvers and was ready to block every attempt at control. The bank cards remained in her custody, household rules were enforced, and any violation was met with calm but firm consequences. By the end of the week, Amanda reached a breaking point. She had relied on her privileges for so long that facing accountability felt unbearable. She screamed at my mother one afternoon, accusing her of overreacting, claiming the house was ruining her life. My mother tried to intervene, but Amanda shouted over her, demanding that I be removed from the equation entirely. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. My grandmother's words and authority had already shifted the balance. I held Mia close, letting the chaos unfold around me without interference. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the unraveling continued. Amanda missed deadlines, forgot chores, and showed frustration at every turn. My mother, equally helpless, attempted to micromanage but failed repeatedly. And my father? Well, he retreated entirely, realizing that his attempts to mediate had no weight in the new hierarchy. 2 days later, the real shockwave arrived. Amanda's ex showed up at the door with Lucy, unannounced. He had decided he would no longer allow his daughter to be caught in the crossfire of family drama. Amanda had neglected her responsibilities, and he was taking matters into his own hands. The confrontation was tense, but there was no drama from my side. I welcomed Lucy with open arms, understanding that the child needed stability, care, and consistency, things Amanda could no longer provide. For the first time, I saw Amanda powerless. She had no leverage, no allies, and no way to maintain control. The house, which had been her kingdom, was no longer hers to command. And Lucy, who had been treated as untouchable, was now safe, and quietly learning that her happiness and well-being mattered above favoritism or parental ego. Meanwhile, the neighborhood chatter grew. I began receiving texts from relatives I hadn't heard from in years, some cautious, some accusatory, but all curious. They asked questions, making assumptions about my intentions. I didn't answer most of them. I had no interest in explaining myself. My focus was my daughter Mia, and making sure that she and Lucy could live in a world where they weren't subjected to favoritism or fear. By the end of that week, Amanda and my mother were physically present in the house, but they were shadows of their former selves. My grandmother's rules had forced them into accountability, stripping away the power they had wielded unchecked for decades. Amanda's pride was wounded. My mother's dominance was broken. And the quiet. Oh, the quiet was intoxicating. For the first time in my life, I could feel the possibility of peace. I didn't celebrate loudly. I didn't gloat. I simply observed, learning to savor the calm without letting it make me complacent. Because I knew this was just the beginning of a larger transformation. The household was no longer a battlefield where my mother and sister ruled through fear. It was becoming a place where respect, fairness, and protection, not favoritism or manipulation, would dictate the environment. And for the first time, I could finally envision a future where Mia and Lucy could grow up in safety, and I could live without constantly walking on eggshells. By the time the weekend arrived, the tension in the house had reached a peak I hadn't seen before. Amanda was pacing the living room like a caged animal, muttering complaints under her breath. My mother hovered near the kitchen counter, pretending to bake muffins as if this could somehow erase the reality of what had happened. My father mostly stayed in the garage, pretending to be busy with tools, and Lucy was cautiously exploring the house, trying to make sense of the sudden chaos. I, however, felt a quiet certainty. I had survived eviction, humiliation, favoritism, and neglect. I held Mia in my arms, feeling her small heartbeat, and knew that the battle had shifted irrevocably. But there was one more step before real peace could settle in. That step involved my grandmother. She called a family meeting in the early afternoon, and I wasn't initially sure what to expect. My grandmother has always been practical, strategic, and not one to waste words. When we all gathered in the living room, she didn't start with blame or judgment. Instead, she laid out the facts, calmly and meticulously, leaving no room for manipulation or excuses. She reminded everyone that the house wasn't theirs, that my mother and father had never owned it, that she had provided them a home out of generosity and love, not out of obligation. She stated, with deliberate calm, that favoritism, abuse, and eviction of her grandchildren would not be tolerated again. And then she dropped the bomb. effective immediately, she was transferring partial ownership of the house to me. The room went silent. My mother's face drained of color, Amanda froze mid-breath, and my father blinked as if he'd been slapped. Even Lucy paused in her play, sensing the gravity of the moment. My grandmother didn't allow for reaction. She simply handed over documents to me, explaining that this wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about fairness, protection, and setting the household rules straight for good. I held the papers with a mixture of awe and disbelief. For years, I had been invisible in my own home, overlooked and undervalued. Now, literally in my hands, was proof that I mattered, that my daughter mattered, and that my grandmother would no longer allow abuse to continue unchecked. Amanda's protests came immediately. She accused me of scheming, manipulating, and ruining the family. My mother tried to back her up, though her voice was noticeably weaker. My father attempted to reason, but my grandmother cut through every word with precision. Rules will be followed. Privilege is not guaranteed. Control is no longer yours. Compliance is required. And then came the financial move. My grandmother had already frozen access to the family bank cards, cutting off the resources that had allowed my mother and Amanda to live comfortably while ignoring responsibility. Bills, groceries, and household expenses were now tracked, monitored, and accountable. The power they had wielded for years, the power to manipulate, threaten, and dominate, was completely neutralized. Over the next few days, the consequences became tangible. Amanda, used to living a life of unearned comfort, struggled to meet the basic requirements of her daily life. She argued, shouted, and even tried to appeal to neighbors and relatives for support, but the foundation she relied on had crumbled. My mother, similarly, realized that she could no longer threaten, intimidate, or manipulate without repercussions. Through it all, I stayed calm. I kept Mia close and continued caring for both her and Lucy, who had become increasingly comfortable in this more stable environment. The children's laughter and curiosity reminded me why this fight mattered. This was about their safety, their sense of security, and their understanding that love is not conditional on favoritism or fear. Then came Amanda's last-ditch attempt. She tried to remove Lucy from my care, citing legal technicalities and parental rights. But my grandmother, anticipating such a move, had already arranged for formal custody guidelines, ensuring Lucy's well-being and stability. Amanda had no leverage, no allies, and no means of enforcing her will. The legal and financial protections my grandmother had implemented left her powerless. By the end of the week, Amanda and my mother had retreated. Their dramatic outbursts had no effect. Their power was gone. They remained in the house physically, but they were shadows of the people who had dominated it before. My grandmother's interventions had completely reversed the household hierarchy. And I, for the first time in years, began to feel the faint stirrings of independence. With the house partially under my name, the children safe, and my grandmother's unwavering support, I realized I could begin to plan a life that wasn't dictated by fear or favoritism. I didn't celebrate loudly. I didn't gloat. I simply felt a sense of relief, of possibility, that I had never experienced before. That weekend, I took small steps toward reclaiming my own space. I organized the upstairs bedroom for myself and Mia, a room that Amanda had always considered hers. I began to inventory what we would need for daily life, noting items that would make our routines smoother. For the first time, I felt a sense of control, not over others, but over my own life and environment. By Sunday afternoon, the tension in the house had settled into a new, uncomfortable equilibrium. Amanda and my mother were subdued, aware of their limitations. My father avoided eye contact and focused on mundane tasks. The children moved freely, exploring the space without fear. And I began to realize that this was more than a victory. It was a foundation. A place where Mia and Lucy could thrive, and where I could finally start to rebuild my own life, unshackled from the chains of favoritism and fear. After the storm had passed and the dust of confrontation settled, I began to realize something profound. I could breathe again. It wasn't a triumphant, celebratory feeling. It was quiet, subtle, but infinitely powerful. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was beginning to live. Mia's small hand in mine reminded me daily that this freedom wasn't just for me. It was for her too. The first mornings were strange. No yelling, no slammed doors. No one's shadow hovering over my every move. Mia danced around the kitchen as I made breakfast, spinning in socks, her giggles echoing down the hallway. Lucy followed soon after, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. The two girls began to play together, building forts with pillows, sharing crayons, and sometimes, for a fleeting moment, I could see them forgetting the drama that had engulfed our lives. Meanwhile, my mother and Amanda were still in the house, but their presence no longer carried power. Amanda refused to engage with me, sticking to her room unless forced to participate in chores or interactions. My mother tried small manipulations, compliments laden with guilt, passive-aggressive comments, but they fell flat against the solid boundary my grandmother had established. My father remained the quiet observer, doing menial tasks while avoiding confrontation. I began to structure our days intentionally, creating routines that prioritized stability, comfort, and predictability. Breakfast was followed by quiet playtime, sometimes music, sometimes reading. Nap times became sacred, uninterrupted by the shouting or threats that had once dominated the household. Evenings were calm. I would hold Mia close while reading stories, feeling her warmth against my chest and understanding that we were building something lasting. The first time I realized I could finally plan my life without fear was when I sat with my grandmother over coffee one afternoon. She asked what my vision was, not what I thought I deserved, but what I truly wanted. I confessed that I dreamed of our own apartment, a place where Mia and I could thrive without shadows of the past lurking in every corner. My grandmother smiled knowingly, already having anticipated this desire. She promised to help, setting aside funds for the first year's rent and childcare so I could focus on stability and work. 2 weeks later, I found a small apartment across town. It wasn't luxurious, but it was ours. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a quiet street that felt like a promise. I packed Mia's things, cleared out the room that Amanda had once claimed as hers, and moved quietly. No goodbyes, no drama, just the gentle closing of a door that had once felt like a prison. Returning to the old house for short visits, I noticed the lingering tension. Amanda and my mother adjusted, trying to maintain appearances, but the hierarchy had shifted irreversibly. They had lost the power to intimidate, to demand, to dominate. And for the first time, I felt immune to their manipulations. My grandmother's firm stance had protected us, and now, she silently watched over us from a distance, a quiet guardian of justice and fairness. As weeks turned into months, the dynamics continued to evolve. Amanda posted vague, bitter messages online about betrayal and loyalty. My mother spoke to relatives with carefully curated versions of events, omitting the night she had thrown me and Mia out. Their bitterness was visible, but it no longer reached me. I had built a buffer, a combination of my grandmother's support, legal protections, and my own confidence, that made their past cruelty powerless. Mia flourished in ways I hadn't dared imagine. She no longer woke screaming in the middle of the night, no longer flinched at raised voices. She learned that home could be safe, that adults could be trustworthy, and that love wasn't conditional on favoritism or manipulation. Lucy adapted as well, partially under my care and partially with her father, navigating a life that finally acknowledged her worth. Watching them, I understood that the most profound victories often don't look dramatic. They look like laughter, trust, and freedom. And yet, the old memories lingered. Some nights, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, remembering how my mother had treated us, how Amanda had wielded privilege like a weapon. The weight of years of favoritism, dismissal, and control sometimes crept back into my chest. But each time, I reminded myself, I had survived. I had protected my child. I had reclaimed our lives. And most importantly, I had a choice now. A choice to build a life that wasn't defined by their cruelty. The quiet of our new apartment became our sanctuary. I began to take a part-time job at a small clinic, handling front desk duties. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Mia thrived in this environment, her laughter filling spaces that had long been silent with fear. Lucy visited, giggling and drawing, learning that stability and kindness could coexist even in complicated family situations. And through it all, I learned a simple truth. Power isn't about domination, it's about protection, boundaries, and the courage to stand firm. By the end of the month, our routine had solidified. I no longer lived in fear of favoritism or abuse. Amanda and my mother remained in the old house, bitter and frustrated, but powerless. I had reclaimed my life not by force, but by surviving, standing firm, and letting justice unfold through the careful intervention of my grandmother. For the first time, I felt something I hadn't in years, a profound sense of peace. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was powerful. Mia and Lucy laughed freely, our household was calm, and I finally understood that survival wasn't enough. I had created space to truly live, and to protect those I loved most. The day I turned the key in the lock of our new apartment for the first time, I felt a rush of emotions I couldn't name. Relief, freedom, triumph, and something deeper, a sense that this was finally ours. Not just mine, not just Mia's, but ours. The weight of years of favoritism, cruelty, and manipulation didn't vanish, but it no longer controlled us. The door clicked shut behind me, a symbolic barrier between the past and the life we were about to live. Unpacking boxes, arranging toys, hanging Mia's artwork on the walls, I realized how small actions could feel monumental. Every shelf, every corner, every quiet hallway was ours to claim, ours to shape. No one could dictate who mattered here. No one could decide whose needs came first. For the first time, the concept of home felt like protection, not punishment. The old house remained in the family, but under strict new conditions. My grandmother maintained oversight, ensuring that my mother, Amanda, and my father no longer used it as a weapon. Their return, under her rules, was reluctant and fraught with tension. They adapted outwardly, pretending civility, but the power they once wielded was gone. And that knowledge, more than anything, was liberating. Life in our apartment settled into a rhythm that felt almost luxurious in its simplicity. Mia's laughter filled every room. Lucy came over frequently, each visit reinforcing that home wasn't about possession or favoritism. It was about safety, love, and consistency. I watched the two girls play, build forts, and share secrets, and I knew that the cycle of neglect and invisible favoritism had been broken. Work became my anchor. The small clinic where I took a part-time position allowed me to reclaim my sense of purpose beyond survival. I wasn't just reacting to crises anymore. I was creating stability. My days were structured, my nights calm, and I had the peace of knowing that I had carved out a life that wasn't defined by other people's control. And yet, there were moments when the old memories crept in. Flashbacks of the night we were thrown out, the silent treatment, the constant microaggressions. But with each recollection, I reminded myself, those events no longer had the power to define me. I had survived them. I had acted with dignity, protected Mia, and allowed justice, through my grandmother's intervention, to unfold naturally. I didn't have to fight anymore. I had simply outlasted the toxicity. Months passed. Amanda and my mother, still bitter and frustrated, adjusted to the reality that their privileges were no longer guaranteed. Their social media posts were filled with vague complaints, but in reality, their influence had waned completely. They could no longer manipulate, intimidate, or control. They were reduced to shadows of their former dominance. And I was finally living fully, without fear of eviction, without the constant weight of their favoritism and abuse. One quiet evening, I watched Mia and Lucy run through the small hallway, giggling, chasing each other, and spinning in socks as they had in the first weeks. For a fleeting moment, I saw them free, truly free, from the invisible chains of power games, favoritism, and neglect. My heart swelled with pride and relief. I had not only survived, I had ensured their safety, their happiness, and their ability to grow without fear. The ultimate lesson was clear. Power isn't about control or fear. It's about boundaries, protection, and integrity. My grandmother had enforced that truth with precision. I had lived it by standing firm, by refusing to apologize for injustice, by protecting my child at every turn. And now, in our own space, locked doors, and laughter filling the rooms, I understood that life doesn't just reward patience, it rewards courage. I still visit the old house occasionally. Lucy and Mia run to me with stories, drawings, and laughter. My mother and Amanda are polite, distant, powerless, and reminded daily of the consequences of their favoritism and cruelty. They live there, but it's no longer theirs to control. My father continues in the background, quiet, resigned, part of the household but stripped of his influence. And I live with freedom, safety, and dignity, a life reclaimed, a past survived, and a future finally ours. That night, after tucking Mia into bed and hearing her soft, rhythmic breathing, I walked to the door of our apartment, locked it, and felt the weight of years lift from my shoulders. The key in the lock was more than a mechanism. It was a symbol of survival, justice, independence, and a life built on choices, not fear. Finally, I whispered into the quiet apartment, the only voice that mattered. This is ours. No one can take it from us. And for the first time in my life, it truly was.